Here we are, episode 2. It's officially a series now. And today's subject is the state mascot of California and funk rock icons, the Red Hot Chili Peppers. I've been a fan of this band since I was a kid and am intimately familiar with everything up to, by the way, to a degree, Stadium Arcadium. But everything since then I've only listened to a couple of times max. They've not really been leaving much of an impact on me in recent years. I want to really try and take a slightly more objective look at both the albums that I love and the albums that I've not really given an honest chance to. The band's unique, bass-driven style has always been uniquely capable of conjuring up an earworm for me, and the revolving door of extremely talented guitarists has always made each album sound distinctive from the last, yet have its own sort of wide array of merits and everything. So yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing exactly what hidden gems there are in this discography that maybe I never really found the joy in previously. Anyway, this one's going to be really long because I have a lot to say about a lot of things here, so let's just get on with it, shall we? If there's one thing that the Beatles and the Red Hot Chili Peppers have in common, and there is only one thing that those bands have in common, it's that they both started their careers with an incredibly underwhelming album. The Chili's self-titled record, unless you're like a super avid fan of this band, there is very little reason to listen to it. The lead track and major single off here, True Men Don't Kill Coyotes, is actually pretty good. It's probably the main saving grace of this record. I really like the funky little bass riff, a lot of slapping stuff going on there, obviously Flea installing himself as the bass phenomenon that we know him as. The pre-chorus on this I actually really like. It shows Anthony Kiedis singing in his lower register, which, I don't know, he just sounds really good when he's singing around there. Much better than when he's trying to sing sweetly, which often doesn't come off as well as it should. But outside of that song, I don't know, there's not much that's really grabbing me from this one. It's not produced badly for a first record, honestly. It's very clean, very polished. There's a lot of cool stuff going on. There's a lot of additional horns in here. There's some good ideas on most of the tracks, actually, if I'm being honest. I really like Out in LA's effects-laden guitar solo that sort of sounds like traffic flying by sort of thing. I think that's got a really cool effect on it. Green Heaven features some really political lyrics, which is an oddity from this band, but not completely unwelcome. And Buckle Down shows guitarist Jack Sherman off to be the talent that he is. Perhaps not a great fit for this band, but that is some Van Halen shit that he's laying down on that track. I can see the appeal of the frenetic punk funk stuff that's happening on tracks like Get Up and Jump and Police Helicopter, but they don't really develop the ideas, and it's just a couple minutes of borderline noise, honestly. Again, Green Heaven being probably the second best track after Coyotes also leans into the punk side a bit. It's got some really meaty guitar sounds. It's honestly not a bad track, all things considered. But looking into the other tracks on this record, it's at best underwhelming and at worst uncomfortable. And obviously when I say uncomfortable, I'm talking about the track Mommy Where's Daddy, where Anthony Kiedis plays the role of essentially someone trying to nonce his own daughter, which, especially given the man's own history, is just uncomfortable to listen to. And while there is some cool stuff going on with horns on that track, I literally could go the rest of my life without ever hearing it again and be happy. The album also closes with the track Grandpappy Do Plenty, which is an instrumental, which feels like it's going somewhere but then never actually goes there. These guys are talented musicians, and yet the best they could put together is this sort of sparse, slow-building thing that doesn't actually build. I don't know, it feels like an instrumental track from a movie's OST or something. Yeah, all in all, there's glimpses of where this band are going in this record, there really are, but it's obviously a D tier. It's probably the worst record in their career, and as I say, unless you are a massive fan, just listen to True Men Don't Kill Coyotes and maybe Green Heaven and just forget the rest. I'm not sure whether it's the influence of legendary P-Funk musician George Clinton, who offered his production services to this album, or if it's the return of Hillel Slovak, the band's original guitarist prior to Jack Sherman taking over, who has way more synergy with Flea and a much more funk-influenced style. But Freaky Styley feels like the album that the self-titled wanted to be and just never quite lived up to. There's a lot of stylistic similarities between the two records, in particular the heavy use of horns, which is something that got phased out a lot in the later parts of this band's career, particularly as like hefty punctuation on tracks like The Brothers Cup or American Ghost Dance, or whether it's like as a full integral part of the song, as is the case on quite possibly the two most funky tracks that they've ever recorded, the respective covers of Sly Stone's If You Want Me to Stay and The Meters' Africa, which they changed to Hollywood. Both of these covers are incredibly good. They're both very slinky, very tuneful, very clean. Like, they sound like they are a pure funk band at this point, and while that's not necessarily my favourite genre of music, I think they do a really good job with it. I will actually venture to say that I prefer the Chili Peppers cover of If You Want Me to Stay over the original Sly Stone version, mostly for Kiedis' vocal delivery, which is crazy, but there we go. Neither of these covers particularly venture far from the original context of the songs, but they still sound really good, honestly, and are much better than some of the shit they were doing on the first album. Outside of that, though, they've got just a pretty good selection of songs on here. Like, the first track, Jungle Man, has this really like meaty bass line and this rickety, noisy percussion style. I don't know what it is, but like it goes together really well and like really drives this song forward. I really enjoy listening to this one. Again, American Ghost Dance features Anthony Kiedis really leaning into his Native American roots and talking about like the genocide of his people, and it's like, as I say, a lot more on the nose political stuff than what you normally get from this band again, so it's cool to see. Both Battleship and in particular Nevermind are more of the sort of punk funk stuff they were doing on the first album, but this time it feels a lot more focused. Like, they're really jamming on Battleship, and Nevermind is just fun because it's just the band just calling out a list of all the popular bands at the time and just being like, fuck those guys, listen to us, and I just love the sort of ballsiness of it. Freaky Styley, the title track, meanwhile, is like this like hypnotic driving instrumental piece for the most part. Hillel is just absolutely destroying his guitar over this track. The noises coming out of it are just inhuman, demonic almost, and then there's this constant like churning chant of fuck 'em, just to see the look on their face, and it's just it's so brash, it's so in your face, but honestly I really do love it. And then both Black Eyed Blonde and The Brothers Cup are just flea on top form, honestly. Like, you could just isolate the bass lines for these two songs and I would enjoy just listening to that. Anything on top of that is really icing on the cake, particularly on The Brothers Cup, where the three instrumental band members just really jam on the groove for a good solid minute of this song, and it's just fun to hear musicians on top form having fun, you know what I mean? The album does fall off a bit towards the end. The last sort of 5 tracks don't do a great deal for me. Yodel the Turtle's alright, but it's very silly, even more so than most of the album, and it's hard for me to get over that. And then there's Catholic Schoolgirl's Rule on here, which is honestly, if it weren't for Mommy Where's Daddy on the previous album, it would be the most unsettling thing they've ever written, and is talking a lot about underage sex, and it's like, is this something you really want to put to tape? I guess the 80s were a different time. If you want to include the bonus tracks as well, Millionaires Against Hunger is a really cool closer track, and the fact that that didn't make the original album is a travesty. But all in all, like, this isn't a bad record, and really sort of indicates where the band are going, while still sticking true to their really funk-heavy roots. It's different to what you expect if you're a modern listener of this band, but I genuinely think it is a good listen, regardless. You know what? I'm thinking low B tier for this one. So the Uplift Mofo Party Plan was the Chili's first step towards the more riff-based funk rock that they would eventually come to have as their like main brand, right? And while I can respect the evolution that they went through to get to this point, I honestly don't think they sound as good on this one as they do on Freaky Styley. I think they're in sort of like an awkward middle ground here where they haven't deviated entirely from their roots, but they haven't really polished up the sound that they will come to really exemplify in the early 90s. There's some good songs on here for sure. I mean, I do like the opener, Fight Like a Brave. That is probably the most conventional rock song on this album. As I say, big riffs, big chanting choruses, like there's real meat on here. It sounds like the sort of thing you might hear fans singing at a football match or something. You know, it's got a real earworm quality to it. Funky Crime is a lot more funky, as you might expect. A little noodly bass riff in here. Real good use of a talk box as well, which I think is the only time the band ever used one of those. And then Behind the Sun has like this, like, it's a lot more melodic. It's like almost like a psych rock tune. It's a lot more spacey. And while it maybe goes on a little bit longer than I'd like it to, it's actually quite nice to hear the band sort of put together something a little bit more conventional like this on one of these earlier Free Cure albums. I also quite like their cover of Subterranean Homesick Blues. I think they really take that in a different direction as opposed to their previous covers, which were pretty much note for note. This time they essentially twist the folk rock of Bob Dylan into something more akin to a rap song. No Chump Love Sucker is frenetic. It's another one of these like punkier tunes, possibly the last one that appears in their discography, honestly, and I do quite like those. While Party on Your Pussy, as much as I hate saying that song title, does have a hell of a bass line. All that said though, like, these songs just aren't as immediate, aren't as catchy as what was on the previous record, I don't think. I don't care much for Walking On Down the Road, or Me and My Friends, or even Backwards, which does have a pretty raw guitar tone on it, but aside from that, it just doesn't really go anywhere. There is something weirdly entertaining about hearing Anthony Kiedis yell, "My love is my dick in my hand" in Love Trilogy, but like, that's it. That's all you're really getting from these songs for the most part, just like a moment that makes you go, that's cool, and then it just sort of breezes by you for the most part. And at worst, there's tracks like Skinny Sweaty Man, where it's just like a series of cartoon impressions, and it's like, what am I even listening to here? Again, I can appreciate that the band are evolving their sound and are getting to the point that they're actually going to be putting out some really cool stuff within that very unique style of theirs over the next couple of years, but at this point, it feels really undeveloped, right? I think they would have done a lot better if they'd stuck to, you know, heavy use of horns and more laid back bass grooves and stuff like that, rather than what they're doing on here, which just kind of falls flat a lot of the time. Still leagues ahead of the first album though. I'll call this a C. While the untimely death of Hillel Slovak was undoubtedly tragic, honestly the arrival of new guitarist John Frusciante and new drummer Chad Smith are what made this band what they are. Mother's Milk is so many leagues ahead of all their previous work, it's not even funny. It's like the two new members had something to prove and they brought it in spades. This is such an absolute maximalist of an album. Just listening to the first track, it's so much bigger, so many layers of different guitar effects and just bold, uncompromising riffs on this one. Frusciante and Smith too, for that matter, immediately prove that they are capable of playing alongside Flea and intertwining their individual styles with his. They make a really tight-knit combo on this record. It's also really nice to see them bring back a lot of the more funky elements from Freaky Styley that I feel were missing on the Uplift Mofo Party Plan. Flea returns with his trumpet again on a lot of tracks here. There's saxophone on here. There's a lot more just like slinky grooves as well, like on Sexy Mexican Maid or Subway to Venus, which is honestly one of my favourite tracks on here. Just the little blasts of trumpet, the shifting between like a more raucous, distorted guitar sound and like a slinkier, cleaner one. Obviously the indomitable Flea just nailing the bass track as he always does. I mean, speaking of, listening to the riff he lays down on the Stevie Wonder cover, Higher Ground, is something to behold. And then Nobody Weird Like Me, he's just like playing this ridiculously fast like slapping riff just throughout the entire thing. It's not my favourite song, but it's just the sort of thing that makes you sit back and go, holy shit, what the hell? And then the way that song cascades into this massive, like, grandiose finish as well. Like, you don't expect it, but it hits you out of left field, and it's just really impressive. Knock Me Down is probably the most accessible track on the album. It's very catchy, very immediate. The sort of intimacy of the lyrics on this one as well, with Anthony clearly dealing with Hillel's death and sort of using that as a wake-up call to all the issues he's been having with drugs and everything. It adds a heavy dose of relatability to this song, and the sort of big soulful backing vocals on here as well really sort of up the ante a lot from what they've been doing previously. Taste the Pain as well, like, it's another funkier, smoother tune for sure, but at the same time it almost feels sinister, like something about the sort of sparser production on here, the subtle use of cello and stuff, just sort of the verses in particular just have this sort of ominous vibe to them that I'm really into. Even on what I would probably consider to be some of the weaker tracks on here, there's a lot to find enjoyment in. Like, for example, just Magic Johnson, the inexplicable tribute to the basketball player, is absolutely carried by these absolutely thunderous drums that just unrelentingly thunder throughout the entire thing. And Stone Cold Bush, despite being a rather underwhelming song for the most part, rips into this like 1-2 punch of first a bass solo and then a guitar solo, and they sort of interweave with each other really nicely, and it's such a flex from two incredibly talented musicians, and it's really fun to hear. Finally, the album closes with Johnny Kick a Hole in the Sky, which is one of my favourite Chili songs, honestly. The little bass staccato rundown in the pre-chorus is like a proper earworm of mine that just never leaves. And the choruses are just so big, the testify, testify. It's really like fist in the air stuff, you know what I mean? Thanks to all this and so much more, I was really close to putting this album in S tier. I feel like it missed the mark by a little, dropping into like the very top of A. Mostly because, as I say, there are a couple of weaker tracks on here. I don't particularly rate their cover of Jimi Hendrix's Fire, for example. And while Pretty Little Ditty is a nice showcase of the band's talents and shows Frusciante playing what is essentially a precursor to his sound that you'll hear on the likes of Californication and By the Way, sort of 10-15 years later, it also sort of lurches from part to part without any sort of real cohesion. So yeah, very good record, but I think we're going A here. Okay, so let's just get this out of the way before we mention anything else. Every single track on Blood Sugar Sex Magik is a jam. Every single one of them. The four musicians here, and I include Kiedis in this, are like operating on like the same wavelength, like they share a common brain cell or something here. Like the way the guitars and bass and drums and the vocals, which are often used in like a percussive sense in themselves, almost like an instrument as opposed to a means of lyrical delivery, because let's face it, the lyrics are never good in Chili songs. All the four instruments just interweave and intertwine and build on top of each other in the most satisfying ways that you could ever expect. The grooves are as intricate as they are compelling, and literally I can just spin this record on repeat all day and have fun with it. It's criminal. It really is criminal. Like, I'm unashamed to say it, this is one of my favourite records of all time. So I mean, it's an S. We've covered that it's an S. And I would be here forever if I sat here and went through every single track on this album and explained in detail what I like about them. So I'll just sort of rapid fire a few things, a few moments from this record that I really enjoy, and we can move on, right? So for one thing, I really enjoy the fact that this feels like a truly cohesive album. Like every track runs into the next one. I can't imagine listening to The Power of Equality and it not immediately leading into that cheeky little guitar lick that leads off If You Have to Ask. I can't imagine Under the Bridge ending, Naked in the Rain's off-kilter drum intro not immediately kicking in. I can't imagine that stellar bass groove of Sir Psycho Sexy not following My Lovely Man. While every track has its own bold identity, they all still feel like part of a cohesive whole, right? It's an hour and 14 minutes, this album, and it absolutely flies by. But yeah, to pick out some particular highlights on here, what I can only assume is like scrap metal salvaged percussion that makes up the break in Breaking the Girl, the almighty meaty riff that just drives Suck My Kiss as one of the best earworms in 90s alt rock, the low register singing from Kiedis on the title track that does things to me and I Am a Straight Man, the huge borderline operatic climax to Under the Bridge, the extended jam sessions in Funky Monks that evolve the core riff into something that feels like a jazz fusion group just going at it, the return of the trumpet in Apache Rose Peacock, because God, I love trumpets, the politically charged venom with which the lyrics of The Power of Equality are delivered, and holy hell, the outro to Sir Psycho Sexy. Like, the song is silly as hell, but you forget all of that once. It's not even really a guitar solo, but just this, like, absolute killer groove that just elevates this song into a near transcendental experience. God, I'm being pretentious right now, but goddamn, like, for how tongue-in-cheek a lot of the subject matter is, and not all the subject matter is, don't get me wrong, there's some very serious stuff on here, as I say, Power of Equality, My Lovely Man being a second part in what I call the Hillel Slovak tribute trilogy, and Under the Bridge dealing with Kiedis' lowest point in his drug addiction. But yeah, a lot of the lyrics on here are wild and wacky, and it doesn't matter, because you can lift the lyrics out of the equation and just revel in how good the musicianship on this record is. Yeah, I'm sorry, anyone who tries to say this isn't the peak of this band, and honestly one of the best albums of that decade, clearly just need to sit down and truly envelop themselves in the funk rock odyssey that is Blood Sugar Sex Magik. I feel endlessly immensely vindicated that One Hot Minute, an album which I have loved for well over 2 decades at this point, has actually seen a bit of a critical reevaluation in recent years and actually seems to be finally getting some of the degree of praise that I think it honestly deserves. I mean, I see why it wasn't popular when it first came out. It is so much darker, so much more experimental than what the band had done previously, and a lot more of both of those things than what they would go on to do. So you definitely have to be in the right headspace for it. But I honestly attribute a lot of my current love for the more out there style of music to listening to this record on repeat when I was 12, you know. I mean, this thing kickstarts with Warped, a song that just does not care for convention. Anthony Kiedis is like through layers and layers of vocal processing. He's like drawling these verses which just barely even seem to acknowledge the sort of heavy riffing melody that is being laid down by guitar and bass on here. I love the way the vocals honestly take a back seat. They sort of weave through the rhythms. They only sort of surface occasionally to make it almost indecipherable, but in a really like sort of cryptic, intriguing way, right? Similarly, there's tracks on here like the title track and Coffee Shop and Shall I Be Thy Game. They're just so much bigger, so much heavier. There's a lot of metal influence on here, obviously from Dave Navarro lending his guitar talents to the band, but it feels like his inclusion sort of drives the other members to just go really hard as well. Like the drumming on One Big Mob that's not my favourite track on here, but goddamn it is something to behold. And then yeah, obviously on Coffee Shop, while the verse vocals can be a little bit obnoxious at times, like the immensity, the hugeness of the riff, the sort of air raid siren thing that's going on with the guitars, and then the absolutely like, it's a bass solo, which obviously is nothing new to Flea, but like it's a much cleaner, it's less slap and pop, and it's more just meaty bass tone just going off, and it takes up like the final third of this song, and it is just immense. Similarly, Shall I Be Thy Game with its anti-religious themes, it's so immediate, so boisterous in your face. There's little room for breathing on this track. It does not let up throughout its runtime, and just hearing that immediacy from the guitars it's so not Chili's, but it's definitely an interesting sound. Similarly, Tearjerker, which is an ode to Kurt Cobain shortly after his death, while it is a lot more low-key than these other songs, it is very lushly produced. There's lots of layers of guitars, there's strings on here. It's got this huge, like, echo-drenched chorus. Left on the floor. While the songwriting is more similar to what the band will go on to do, a lot cleaner, a lot more pop-centric, it just has a completely different vibe to anything that the band would do when John Frusciante was at the helm, right? That said, there are some stuff that fits into a more sort of Chili's mould a little bit more, Falling Into Grace, Walkabout, the big lead single Aeroplane. These are all a lot funkier tunes. Flea is used to drive the song, as he often is, with a really distinctive bass part, or just the general sort of laid-back vibes of these songs is a lot more in keeping with what you would expect from the band. There is obviously some stuff on here that matches their legacy, shall we say. And My Friends, I think, is a really underrated ballad that features this like really cleanly picked guitar and just honestly like a really simple, direct, but just really infectious melody. That my friends are so depressed and standing on the brink of emptiness. It's like a nice little run up and down the vocal range, which is just nice to hear, honestly. And then the album closes off with Transcending, which is honestly the worst part about this album not being a commercial success for me is that I will never hear Transcending live, because that song goes places. It features like full-on screaming, fuck the nothing scene, fuck the green machine. Like, Anthony Kiedis is just here to get his opinions across, and he does not care what you think about that. It's such a dark, like, climactic moment, and the fact that it rounds off the album is so out of character for these guys, because normally they end on something like sweet and simple, and this is so far from that, it's untrue. Honestly, for me, One Hot Minute is an S tier. It used to be my favourite record. I now probably don't rate it quite as highly as Blood Sugar, but oh my god, it is a thrill ride of an album. And honestly, you should go give it a listen even if you don't like the band, because there's some stuff on here that might surprise you. So the return of John Frusciante sees the band essentially take an album to figure out what their style is going to be for the rest of their career. The more polished, like arena-style pop rock that we come to know as the band's signature sound is basically honed on here. There's a lot of tracks that essentially form the blueprint for that going forward. Like the choruses on this album are immense, I'm not going to deny it, like Parallel Universe, Other Side, This Velvet Glove. These songs have such massive, like, earwormy, infectious sing-along choruses that just come out of nowhere half the time, and they just really leave a really lasting impact, I would say. This Velvet Glove in particular is one of my favourite songs from this band, full stop. I really like the guitar tone on this one, the way it's more of a guitar-led song as well, which is uncommon in their discography that's normally much more bass-centric, and there's just something about the melodies on it that just really get the blood pumping every single time. But for each of these songs and each of the slightly more lackluster pop rocky tunes like Easily or Emmett Remus, which kind of relies super heavily on this repeating bass riff that makes it sound almost like what would happen if like a noise rock band like Shellac or someone were to lay down a rhythm section and then the Chili Peppers were to play over the top of it. It's weird and disorienting, and I don't really like it much. Or a song like Saviour, which honestly is just too bombastic and too in your face. Well, I do really like the B parts on this song where there's a lot of like vocal harmonizing and a more sort of spacious sound to it. Like the A parts are just obnoxious, honestly. So yeah, there's a lot of good and bad pop rocky stuff on this record, but there's also a lot of stuff that like was clearly just the band trying things, which I can respect quite a bit, honestly. Like, I'm not a huge fan of the funkier numbers on here, like I like Dirt or Purple Stain, which honestly seems to be about fingering a girl on her period, and I get a little bit sick just listening to. But there's also some like callbacks to their earlier career with some punkier stuff. Get On Top and Right on Time in particular, just really high energy, really sort of fast in your face tracks that I enjoy quite a bit. And then at the other end of the spectrum you got some of the slower numbers, like the sort of more intimate guitar and bass interweaving sound of Road Tripping, the closer, or Californication itself, which is such a maligned track. It's so unfairly done by, like, yeah, okay, they say the word California in it, haha, that's the meme, but the tone, that beautiful guitar lick that plays throughout, the lyrics, honestly, taking a really sort of cynical look at the sort of commodification and fakeness of Hollywood. Like, it's a really good tune, and I think it gets unfairly done by. Justice for Californication. But while there is a lot of good on this album, there's something, I don't know if it's the mixing or what, everything is just so compressed and loud and overblown so much of the time, and this works on occasion, like the intro to Around the World, which really just slaps you in the face and gets your attention off the bat, or the huge climax to Parallel Universe. It doesn't always fall flat, but so much of the time it's like, could we not just rein it in a bit and like maybe give focus to specific instruments rather than just have everything pounding in your face constantly throughout this album? I don't know. It feels like even some of the songs I like less would have been more enjoyable if they had a better production job done on them, but I don't know, maybe that's just me. All in all, I could hardly call this their best album, but there's some good stuff here. There is some good stuff here. I'll call it a B, I think. By the Way seems to mark the first and possibly only point in the Red Hot Chili Peppers' career where virtuosity took a back seat in favour of just doing what the song requires. The tracks on this album are not always necessarily showcases of the incredible musicianship present in this band, but more just a series of tightly written, tightly produced pop rock bangers, and if that's what they were setting out to achieve here, then they did that with aplomb. Like, there are moments of talent on display here, for example in the title track with the big meaty bass riff that accompanies the instrumental sections, but then at the same time it's like the big jubilant choruses, particularly on its final repetition where the full gang vocals come in, that are the true earworm on this track for me. Similarly, through Away, Your Television lays down a really strong bass groove and an even stronger drum rhythm, but it's the way those drums are panned hard left and right in my headphones that do it for me more than the technicality of the song does. Venice Queen, the closer, shows some super clean guitar picking and this really like bold open strumming section in the latter half, but again it's just the energy and the gumption of the song that tie it together far better than the technical work ever could. Meanwhile, some of the other best tracks on here, like On Mercury for example, just bobs along on a little simple harmonica rhythm and like is all about the vocal delivery and the sheer energy of it. or Don't Forget Me, which honestly shows Anthony Kiedis able to sing his lungs out on the choruses, which form this really cool contrast with the start bass strumming and subtle tremolo pick guitar that make up the verses. And then you got tracks that just don't sound like the Chili Peppers at all, really. Like Midnight is all strings and layers of vocals, which is a technique they also use on the choruses of Tear, a song that honestly sounds almost Beatles-esque with its harmonies and its descending piano motif and its trumpet section. These are cool songs, and it makes you wonder how many more of these the band has thrown away throughout their discography because they just didn't fit with their usual vibe. Even the tracks on this record that don't do it for me so much, like the strange flamenco stylings of Cabron, or the saccharine ballad I Could Die For You, or kind of boring Universally Speaking and Warm Tape, have production and dynamics and attention to detail far outstripping anything that was on Californication. Even if I don't necessarily enjoy the songwriting on display in all of these songs, I can at least get behind the sheer effort that went into them. So yeah, by the way, is just the best pop rock incarnation of the Chili Peppers, if you ask me. This one's an A tier. This is a great example of why it's important that I revisit each of these albums before I give my opinion on them, because I was fully prepared to write this album off as the beginning of the end for the Red Hot Chili Peppers, and while it is bloated and in many cases a little underdeveloped, I do think there is a lot of good stuff amongst the 28 tracks on Stadium Arcadium. To begin with, I think this album hosts the strongest set of ballads in their discography. Wet Sand is on here, which is an absolutely gorgeous tune, some really tight little genteel guitar passages with some really evocative emotional lyrics, and then this absolutely soaring solo in the back half. I absolutely love this song. That runs back to back with Hey, which is a much more slow-paced, heartfelt little number, which is honestly just really pretty in its own right. There's also She Looks To Me on here, which is just pop perfection. It really is. The choruses on this thing just cut through you like a knife, with these layers of strong backing vocals and more strong guitar licks from John Frusciante, who I have to say is probably on top form on this album, for his entire career. Basically every track has something going on with the guitar, some glorious little piece of noodling or intricate little tightly picked pattern. And for prime example, just look no further than Turn It Again, which sees Frusciante and the other boys just absolutely jamming on a groove for several minutes towards the back half of it. It honestly would have made a really strong closer just hearing these guys just going at it until they can't anymore. But then there's some more straightforward, heavy riffing, almost Led Zeppelin-esque tracks on here as well, like Ready Made, which has this really sort of hacksaw groove to it, really bluesy sort of thing, or Torture Me, which just sees this wall of guitar sound just completely roar in and just drown the funky little bass riff that plays throughout the song. Even a lot of the less developed songs, shall we say, have some really fun stuff going for them. Death of a Martian doesn't feel as complete as perhaps a closing track could be, but I do really like the almost spoken word sort of steady build up of the climax of the song. Meanwhile, Hard to Concentrate is super low-key, super spacious, but just has this really silky bass tone on it that the song just bobs along on, and it's quite a pleasant listen, honestly. And even songs that I remember really not liking, like Hump to Bump, this song might have one of the most obnoxious choruses in Chili's history, but it's got a really funky little groove to it, the sort of thing which feels like it's somewhat lacking throughout the rest of the album, outside of a couple of spots like the infectious grooves of Tell Me Baby or the pure jubilance of Make You Feel Better. I don't think every track on this album is a complete home run, but there's a lot of good stuff on here, there really is. I'd say the Ringers do outnumber the slightly more drudgery, dirgy songs on here, like Desecration Smile or We Believe or Animal Bar, which honestly I could quite happily just skip. Yeah, this album could definitely be cut down to a single disc and would quite possibly be one of the stronger releases as a result of that, but it does get a little bogged down in itself from time to time, so realistically I do think this is the top of B tier. It's just a bit of a shame because I think it could have been quite a lot more. Okay, so before I say anything else, I just want to say no disrespect to Josh Klinghoffer. The man is clearly a very talented musician and fills John Frusciante shoes very nicely on the next couple of albums, but there's just so much phoning in going on this record. Like, it feels like they just didn't really want to put out a new album and instead just wrote some Chili Peppers by the numbers tunes, right? I mean, the album almost successfully sacks me out with the opening track, Monarchy of Roses, which leads with this, like, furious feedback and these super distorted vocals and everything. You're like, what is this? This sounds like something Scratch Acid would write, you know, like, but then suddenly, it just does a complete 180 and turns into this ultra polished, like, as I say, Chili's by the Numbers is the best way to describe it. Slightly quote-unquote funky but not particularly remarkable bass line with Anthony Kiedis just spewing some gibberish over the top. It's like, I don't know, man. There's so much of this on this album, like Factory of Faith, Ethiopia, the closer, Dance Dance Dance, which might be my least favourite closer to any Chili's album. They're just, like, completely unremarkable. There's tracks on here that I don't even, like, remember at all. Like, did I let you know that could be a song? I've just listened to it, but fuck knows. Meet Me at the Corner is, like, trying to go for a sort of more tender sort of thing, like they've done previously. But in the case of tracks like Hey or My Friends, they do it really tastefully. Here, it's massively overproduced and there's too much going on and it just distracts from, like, the sincerity of it. Police Station is, like, nearly 6 minutes long and I really wish it wasn't. That's basically all I can say on that one. For all this, though, the track does have the occasional good moment, the occasional thing that makes me think that you could maybe salvage a decent EP out of the tracks on this album. Brendan's Death song does basically one of my favourite things in music, which is takes a slow minimalist piece and just slowly builds on it throughout the course of a song until it erupts into this massive, like, rowdy, chaotic climax, and it does a pretty good job of it, outside of the fact that Anthony Kiedis is just for some reason shouting in the quiet moment at the start of the song, and it's like, just tone that in just a little bit, just rein yourself in a little. The Adventures of Rain Dance Maggie is one of the only tracks on here that has a bass line that is actually pretty infectious and carries the sort of legacy of the funky pop tune that they've been sort of trying to corner for themselves over the previous decade. And Goodbye Hooray is probably one of the highlights of this album. It's like for the first time since One Hot Minute they remembered they have Flea in the band and let him do a bass solo and it fucking rips. And the entire song is just, like, really high energy, jubilant. It has the same sort of vibes that make you feel better off the previous album had, and it's just incredibly danceable and incredibly fun. Finally, Even You Brutus is pretty cool, honestly. It's pretty cool. Not only is the chorus, like, huge and sing-along and anthemic, but there's also, like, an almost, like, theatrical style to it. I really like the vibrancy of the verses, the jaunty piano melody, which buoys Kiedis' like spoken word diatribe. It's pretty cool. And yet for every half-decent moment like this, every song that makes me go, oh, actually, maybe these guys have still got it, there is a song like Look Around, which is quite possibly the most aggravating thing I've ever heard. Like, just any sample of the lyrics from this thing is just embarrassing, even by their usual standards, and the entire song just goes nowhere, does nothing, and then peters out, and it's like, why? Why is this here? I'm going to be generous on account of a few of the decent tracks on here and put this in C tier, although part of me really wants to just drop it in D and have done with it. I almost didn't include this one in the tier list because I'm Beside You is actually a selection of outtakes from I'm With You, which were then released as singles and eventually compiled onto a single release. But I think it's worth acknowledging for the fact that these tracks are generally more experimental, more creative than the sort of more radio-friendly stuff that ended up on I'm With You. And while they don't always necessarily successfully follow through on their ideas, it's nice to see that the band still have that spark of creativity in them 30-odd years into their career, right? I'm not saying they're all winners. I mean, I almost shut this album off and just decided not to include it after the first 3 tracks because Strange Man is quite possibly the most boring thing on here. Magpie's on Fire is just a toothless ballad with no major redeeming qualities, and Long Progression is at least trying something from a technical perspective but doesn't really leave much of a lasting impression as far as like earworms are concerned. There's also some other major slip-ups on here, like the Americana-drenched Hometown Gypsy, which just doesn't feel like it's in their wheelhouse at all. Hanalei, which sounds like the back end of Venice Queen with a dog shit chorus thrown into the middle of it, and is only really kept afloat by the rampant manic drumming of Chad Smith. Or The Sunset Sleeps, which has this really cool, like, retro 60s guitar tone, but is just completely rendered null and void as soon as Anthony Kiedis opens up his mouth and starts doing this weird, like, run up and down his vocal range thing, which just grates on me. But yeah, there's still some pretty great stuff on here. Like, Victorian Machinery has, like, this really industrial, grinding riff to it. Like, it's probably the heaviest thing they've ever recorded, honestly, and just, like, juxtaposes these massive, explosive verses with these much more tender choruses, and it actually works really well in this sort of jarring back and forth sense that it builds. Never Is a Long Time is just a sweet little pop song. Shortest track on the record, it definitely just blasts through this sweet little melody, and there's something really, like, theatrical and bold about it. I just quite enjoy listening to this one. Pink as Floyd wears its influences on its sleeve. It's very atmospheric. The moment that sort of, like, warm bass comes in, it just has a very Floydish feel to it. It's a lot more energetic and polished and Chili's-esque, I guess, overproduced perhaps is the term, than a lot of what Pink Floyd were doing in, like, the mid-70s, but it definitely evokes that era. Your Eyes Girl has this, like, thudding, monumental, like, almost like desert rock vibe to it. It walks a thin line where it could have just been really boring, but just the boldness and the assertiveness of it just really gets your attention. I really just like the vocal melodies on Catch My Death, and just a little bum bum bum, like, backing vocal hums, I guess, that it just all comes together and gels really nicely. It's not doing anything particularly mind-blowing, but it's a nice song. And I really love the sort of wild, hectic, like, garage rock style riff on This Is the Kit. Even if the choruses don't do much for me, I think the verses, particularly with these, like, weird vocal effects that sort of swim in and out on Anthony Kiedis' voice, it gives it this, like, weird robotic feel that isn't completely unwelcome. While Open Closes, it's like Anthony Kiedis just acting like a street preacher. He's just ranting about stuff from his past experiences with his friends and everything. There's basically very little singing on this song, but having that just over the top of this absolutely wild, like, cacophony of guitars and bass and drums just going to town and screeching their way through various hyper-aggressive movements, and then eventually just coming to a climax with this, like, weird children's choir backing up Anthony's rantings. It's a weird closer, but I like it a hell of a lot better than Dance Dance Dance, I'll tell you that much. Finally, it's worth noting the 8-minute track on here, In Love Dying, which, honestly, it feels pretty good at first. It's got this, like, jazzy rhythm section going on. It's clearly trying something, and it's doing a not bad job of it, but then it just sort of goes for another 5 minutes, where Josh Klinghoffer is clearly just improvising very little over this rhythm, and it's, I guess, their closest thing to King Crimson's Moonchild I've ever heard, which could be seen as a compliment to some people, but for me it just kind of meanders. But yeah, I mean, I'll happily take songs that don't quite live up to their potential, but are clearly trying fresh ideas over the sort of blandness of I'm With You. So while there's definitely some tracks I could cut off here, I have to say this is the much superior album, and no, we'll go high C for now, I think. Not quite B tier, but definitely a marked improvement.
Suicide a month before I met you.
So I initially wasn't holding up much hope for The Getaway when the opening lyrics were, "That's right, you're right, we will do our thing tonight, alright." It speaks volumes about the lyrical content of latter-day Chili songs, and honestly, as this song continued to not evolve and just sort of stay incredibly one note throughout its duration, I was like, I think they've lost it, honestly. And there were some other songs on here that reinforced that opinion. Quite a few relatively boring cuts, forgettable pieces, and even some of the ones that aren't that forgettable, such as the closer, Dreams of a Samurai, which has got some fun ideas and quite a compelling bass hook, but just feels really scatterbrained and just pieces a lot of different, slightly over-dramatic ideas together into something that doesn't quite really achieve much. Or this Ticonderoga, which is even worse in that it feels like two completely different songs just stitched together in the middle. There's ways to contrast two different ideas in a single song, and this ain't it, chief. And then there's Go Robot on here, a song which sort of attempts to latch on to the sort of synthetic disco thing that Daft Punk were doing a few years before this, and it just feels massively outdated and trend chasey. But all that said, there are some actually really cool songs on this record. Dark Necessities was the lead single off here, and it grooves, man. It really does. I'm not really a hand claps guy normally, but they really make good use of them to punctuate this absolute killer bass groove, and the choruses are just really jubilant, really invigorating. I really do actually enjoy this one a lot. Goodbye Angels, meanwhile, just like has an incredible mastery over the sort of build and release of tension. Like, particularly the first verse just slowly builds and builds this guitar riff into something that feels like it's just about to erupt at any time, and then the choruses come in and they genuinely do. They're just huge, bombastic. I absolutely love this song, genuinely. One of my favourites in their discography, honestly, and definitely a song I'm going to be going back to a lot, I think. Feasting on the Flowers is another one that could have been very scatterbrained, but I think it meshes its ideas really well. I love the little synth flourishes in the background with the verses, and then the entire back end where the big, like, hammering piano chords come in. It just ups the ante again on what was already a pretty fun song to be a really dramatic moment on the album. Speaking of dramatic moments, The Hunter, the song just before the closer, is such like a heartfelt, raw piano ballad. Like, I wasn't expecting it amongst all the sort of polish and high production levels that we've been seeing across this album, but there's something a lot more intimate about this one, and lyrically it actually holds up a lot and proves that there is still life in this old dog yet, as far as writing something that actually means something is concerned. And then there's Detroit, which is such a dirty rocker. It's got so much grit behind it. It honestly could sit quite comfortably on One Hot Minute. And it's impressive to see these guys in their 50s just tearing out a balls to the wall rocker like this. I have a really good time with this one. So yeah, this album is by no means perfect, but it's really put into perspective how capable these guys are still of putting together a good collection of songs, even well into the 2010s. I think between this and I'm Beside You, I've really come to reflect on I'm With You, and that album is undoubtedly D tier. This one, however, top of C. Fucking hell, this album was boring. You'd think having the legendary John Frusciante back would put the band back on course, allow them to create something that feels truly classic again, but instead, it just feels like they completely derailed the good thing that they were building towards with The Getaway. Like, this is the first time since the debut where I've struggled to pick 3 highlights for one of their records. The only song that I would say I actively enjoyed was Aquatic Mouth Dance, which has the worst title, but aside from that, it just feels like it's truly like Flea Unleashed, like Super Saiyan Flea going at this track. The bass line is just this constantly evolving, ridiculously groovy riff, and he's also bringing a lot of trumpet flourishes to this tune as well. It's just like pure funk rock ecstasy. It could fit comfortably on Californication and be one of the better tracks on there. But after that, man, I guess the lead single and first track, Black Summer, isn't too bad. I do quite like the vocal delivery on the verses, has a really like soothing melody about it. The chorus I could take or leave, but there's also a pretty sort of rip-roaring guitar solo on here, the sort of thing that it feels like we've been missing with the absence of John Frusciante. Although there is like a weird like Irish lilt thing that Anthony Kiedis keeps putting into the inflection of certain words, and I don't know where that's coming from. He also drove me up the wall on the closer Tangelo, where for some reason it's almost like he's doing like a Bob Dylan impression. I think it's like the simplicity of the sort of folky tune that they're trying to close on here. He just felt like it needed to sound like Bob, and I don't know what it is. There's just something in the way that he's singing, like it, I don't know, very weird. And there's a few tracks on here that I almost feel like I could have got behind, but they just don't really develop the idea properly. Like Poster Child, which has another pretty cool, like, display of talent by the rhythm section, and I quite like the sort of rattling off of the influences that Kiedis is doing on the verses, and even the chorus isn't too bad, but I don't know, it just feels like it drags on way too long. Like, you think the song's done, and then, hey, here's another verse, we're still going, this thing's just still trucking on. And that seems to be like a recurring theme I have here. Like, The Great Apes is such a nothing burger, and then they just drag it on, and it's only 5 minutes long, but it feels like it's like 10, you know? And there's this like really bland guitar solo on here that just feels like some sort of butt rock cliche. It's Only Natural also feels like a fairly harmless track. It has like this kind of cool slap pop bass line. It's quite simplistic, but it has that tone that has worked for so many Chili songs in the past. But again, it's just another song that just keeps on going, and I'm just like, does this album end? Is there any sort of light at the end of this tunnel? And goddamn, The Heavy Wing is another one that, like, despite some pretty cool displays of drumming and not too bad a song structure in general, you know, I again quite like the melodies on here, but oh my god, why is it 5.5 minutes long? Veronica's probably going to be my third pick on here. It's quite sweet, nothing too outrageous going on here, although I do like the end. It builds to quite a nice satisfying climax. And Bastards of Light starts strong with like these sort of urgent stabbing synths, like they're clearly trying to do something different with this one, but then it just sort of falls back into old habits and loses everything that made it unique about halfway through. And the less said about She's a Lover, better, honestly. Like, it's just another one of those songs that just annoys the fuck out of me. These Are the Ways isn't much better either. The fact that those two are back to back is honestly just loses me completely in the middle of the album. So yeah, at best, Chili's by numbers, at worst, just slurry. Like, this might be their worst album. D as fuck. If there's one thing the Chili Peppers, and particularly modern Chili Peppers, really need, it's quality control. It was an issue with I'm With You and I'm Beside You, it was an issue with Stadium Arcadium, and it's an issue here on the second album released in 2022, and while it does feel like a notable step up from the dreariness that was Unlimited Love, there's still a lot on here that I regret spending my precious minutes of life on. Don't get me wrong, there's times when I listen to this album and I'm thinking, you know, actually I quite like it, particularly around the middle section. There's a pretty strong run of tracks. Afterlife's one of my favourites on here. It's really slinky, really smooth, enjoyable funk pop stuff. There's some cool interplay between bass and guitars, the sort of thing, honestly, that hasn't been seen a lot since, like, the Blood Sugar days. In fact, that is something they seem to want to return to quite a lot on this album, particularly on the opener, Tip of My Tongue, which also does a pretty good grand display of, like, the tightness that this band has. Although they do sort of take me out of that a bit when they start referencing Funky Monks. I think they do this later on the album as well with the song Funky Crime. It's like they're calling back to their previous stuff just to remind you, hey, we were good once, you know? Not long after Afterlife, there's some other fun tracks on here. I like Handful quite a bit. It's more slow-paced, more lumbering. It has like almost this sort of jazzy aesthetic to it that I actually quite like. It maybe wouldn't be a highlight on any other album, but it's functional enough here that it keeps my attention through into the drummer, which I just genuinely love the aesthetic of. It's got these like urgent like Final Fantasy battle music synths, which are amplified more by this like bass line that has no business being as dirty as it is. Like, it honestly, it stinks of 90s video gaming, and that's, you know, obviously going to push all my nostalgia buttons. But then the transition into this like jubilant gang vocal like chorus does a lot for me, honestly. It's a really fun song. And that then flows into Bag of Grins, which is also a pretty good track, maybe a little over long, but I really like the ominousness of the really sort of down-tuned rumbling bass and these like thudding Marshall drums. It's a really cool aesthetic on this thing. Other highlights include Bella, which again feels like a big throwback to their earlier stuff. Very funky, very groovy. Really got this like sleek, mellow funk style that absolutely jams. There is the line on this song, "Hell no, my name ain't Bradley," which is... I just literally laughed out loud when I heard it. It's so ridiculous, but whatever, it's fine. The song is fun, so credit where it's due. And Copperbelly's clearly trying something by going for like a 3/4 waltz sort of style, and could have been quite a good song if it weren't for the fact that Kiedis just sings on the beat throughout the entire song. There's very little to differentiate the chorus from the verse, and it ends up being quite monotone, honestly. And it's kind of all downhill from there. The song La 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 La, yeah, I think that was enough la's. Feels like it's trying to do something personal and impactful, but the whole thing is very one note and lays on top of like this constant droning synth line that honestly came close to putting me literally to sleep. Similarly, Shoot Me a Smile is just the most forgettable song I have possibly ever heard. Peace and Love is just cliches and cliches. Fake as Fuck does that thing that the Chili's have been doing a lot lately, where they just sort of stitch a chorus onto a verse where it doesn't match at all, and it just feels completely out of place. And I think they thought the chorus would have a lot more impact than it does. It just comes across as almost poserish, like really, oh look, we said a bad word, but there's no real grit or meaning behind it. Eddie is supposedly a tribute to Eddie Van Halen. I don't really know much about the dude, but I hope to God he plays guitar better than the three incredibly mind-numbingly predictable guitar solos that are ham-fisted into here. Like, this is about as butt-rocky as it gets. And then there's My Cigarette. My Cigarette, with its god-awful drum machine beat. It's like, dude, you have Chad Smith right there. I honestly thought the album art for this album was AI generated upon first looking at it, and this song honestly makes me think some of the music might be too. They also use the drum machine to a slightly better effect on In the Snow, a song that makes a good start by sort of conjuring these cold, standoffish vibes that evoke the name of the song quite well, but then it just does absolutely nothing with its 6-minute runtime, aside from just drop some ugly ass lyrical miracle bullshit halfway through, like, so yeah, I mean, it's more notable than Unlimited Love for having anything going on with it at all, but I don't see this album clawing its way out of D tier. Well, there you have it, and I'll be honest, while the more modern albums in this band's discography lived up to my expectations more or less of being somewhat underwhelming and not quite up to the standard that we expected from the band's earlier work, I was genuinely impressed to find quite a few individual songs that I actually kind of like. The Getaway in particular is an album that I've gone back to since reviewing it, and yeah, I'm having fun with it. It's pretty good. Might even sneak into B tier one day if I'm feeling really generous. I've done my best to avoid my innate biases based on the fact that I've enjoyed this band's work for a very long time and tried to be some degree of objective when it comes to talking about them, but I have been genuinely quite impressed to see that this band are still able to put out some really quite enjoyable work well into their 4th decade of recording. Like, even at their worst, I'm very rarely actually offended by this band's music. Like, there's some stuff, particularly on Unlimited Love, that just washes over me and is a bit of a non-starter, but compared to a lot of their peers, a lot of other bands that came up in the late 80s and 90s, a lot of the alt-rock scene from back then, I think they've always had a very unique identity, a very distinctive flavour. They've polished it and refined it, and that's not necessarily always been to the good. There's a degree of clinical overproduction that's gone into some of the more recent releases, and by more recent I mean the latter half of their discography. But even then, there's something uniquely Chili Peppers about the music they make. There's genuinely some artistry in the way they manage to mesh the sort of virtuosic, is that a word? Extremely talented musicianship with these really sort of easily digestible pop hooks, and the fact that they're still able to do this so far into their career to such an impressive extent is honestly worthy of accolade. As far as I'm concerned, anyone who has even a passing interest in rock music should listen to Blood Sugar Sex Magik, One Hot Minute, and probably Mother's Milk as well. And while I fully understand that their specific brand isn't necessarily for everyone, I'll always love the Chili's, man. Anyway, thanks for watching. I have an ever-growing list of artists I want to dig into, the first of which might be along sooner than you would expect because they don't have the world's biggest discography, certainly not the size of the Beatles or the Chili Peppers anyway, so keep your eyes peeled for that, and I will see you around. Bye.
Fuck you, asshole. You homophobic redneck.